Hello and welcome to my channel. In this lecture we will talk about the basal ganglia or basal nuclei. So let's start. The basal nuclei or ganglia are a major component of the motor system and many systems. Actually, they are involved in almost every function of the brain, involved in if not all, in most, if not all, of 4 brain functions, as I told you. And there are collections of gray matter within the white matter, so they are deep down and receive all signals from the cortex and almost all the output to the cortex. So they are an intermediate link between the orders coming out of the cortex and the feedback coming into the cortex. They consist of the lentiform nucleus. Lentiform means lens form, composed of putamen and globus pallidus, caudate nucleus, subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra, and the corpus striatum. The corpus striatum is the anterior fused ends or connected ends of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. This is called the neostriatum, the caudate nucleus plus the putamen, and the paleostriatum is the remainder of the lentiform nucleus, which is the globus pallidus. Some fiber tracts associated with the basal nuclei is the ansa lenticularis. It comes off from the globus pallidus and to the thalamus. It's part of the thalamic fasciculus. It loops around the edge of the internal capsule. There is another fasciculus called the fasciculus lenticularis, also from the globus pallidus to the thalamus. It's part of the thalamic fasciculus and passes, instead of looping around the edge of the internal capsule, it passes through the internal capsule. Together with the ansa lenticularis and the cerebellothalamic fibers, these are called the thalamic fasciculus. Also, we have a bunch of fibers called the striato-nigra fibers from the corpus striatum, which is the anterior part of the putamen and the caudate nucleus, to the substantia nigra reticulata, which is the anterior part of the substantia nigra. Neuro fibers from the substantia nigra compacta, which is the posterior part of the substantia nigra in the midbrain, to the striatum in the opposite direction. The caudate nucleus, this is the caudate nucleus here. See, the caudate nucleus, and this is the lentiform nucleus, the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. It's comma-shaped and has a head and body and tail. The head and body are in the lateral ventricle. They form the lateral wall and the floor of the lateral ventricle, and the tail in the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, in the temporal lobe, I mean. It goes to the amygdala, the tail, at the end of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. The head fuses with the putamen to form the corpus striatum, and the tail ends, as I told you before, in the amygdaloid nucleus. The internal capsule's anterior limb, this is the internal capsule here, this is the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. The anterior limb separate the caudate nucleus from the putamen, and the area of fusion with the putamen is called the nucleus accumbens. You can see it here. This gray matter connecting the anterior parts of the putamen and the caudate nucleus, the nucleus accumbens. Together they are called the corpus striatum. The lenticular nucleus, which is this part, the lenticular nucleus, it has a pale part, which is the globus pallidus, and an outer part, which is the putamen, composed of the globus pallidus and putamen. putamen being the outer part, as you can see here. It has an internal medullary lamina, medial medullary lamina, and lateral medullary lamina, separating the globus pallidus from the putamen, and an external capsule is the white matter you see here underneath this thin strip of gray matter, which is called the claustrum, and it lies underneath the white matter of the insula. This is the insula, the one you see here, and this is the lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus, in the base of which lies the insula, separating from the external capsule of the lentiform nucleus. You can further subdivide in the globus pallidus into globus pallidus internum and globus pallidus externum, according to their connections. Globus pallidus internum and globus pallidus externum. See, this is the corpus striatum here. This is the anterior end of the lentiform nucleus. This is the caudate nucleus. This is the internal capsule, and this is the nucleus accumbens here. Together they are called the corpus striatum. This is the septum pellucidum separating the two lateral ventricles, and this is the corpus callosum, as you can see here. This is the insula and the lateral sulcus. Okay. The subthalamic nucleus. The subthalamic nucleus, it's in the posterior part of the diencephalon. It's below the posterior part of the thalamus, right above the substantia nigra of the midbrain. The subthalamic nuclei composed of the subthalamic nucleus, a nucleus called the zona incerta, the prerubral field of Forel nuclei, the fasciculus lenticularis and ansa lenticularis, and the upper ends of the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. All these form the subthalamic nuclei, with the subthalamic nucleus is part of these nuclei. It's this region here. This region. This is the subthalamus. Substantia nigra, remember, in this technique the white matter appears black and gray matter appears white. This is the substantia nigra. In the rostral part of the midbrain, it's loaded with melanin pigment, and between the basis pedunculi, or the crus cerebri, and the red nucleus, this is the red nucleus, there's a part extends rostrally in the diencephalon itself, and composed of two parts. Substantia nigra compacta, which is the posterior part, it's the part you see here, and substantia nigra reticulata, it's this part, the anterior part. See how it's threaded rather than the posterior compact part. This is the substantia nigra compacta, and this is the substantia nigra reticulata, which is the anterior part. Now, connections and circuitry of the basal ganglia. You have the principal circuit, upon which all other circuits follow the the pattern. There is a Putamen circuit, the Caudate Circuit, and substantia nigra circuit, and the subthalamic circuit. Now, the principal circuit is that outflow from the cortex go to the corpus striatum, and from it to the globus pallidus, and then from it to the through the thalamic fasciculus pardon me, to the thalamus, the ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei, and from there again back to the cortex. This is the principal circuit. See, the cortex, the corpus striatum, the globus pallidus, through the thalamic fasciculus to thalamus, especially ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei, and back to the cortex. As you notice here, there is no major output to the lower motor neurons, It's only a link in the cortical loop, and they influence the activity of the cortex by being in the middle of the command outflow like that. It works on what comes out of the cortex, and the circuit is in one hemisphere, so it affects the contralateral body. This is the principal circuit of the basal ganglia. The Putamen Circuit the outflow comes out of the somatosensory cortex, somatosensory areas, the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, which is anterior to the primary area, the supplementary motor cortex, which lies on the medial frontal gyrus, on the medial side of the brain. Those project out to the putamen, and from it to the globus pallidus, and through the thalamic fasciculus to the thalamus, ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei, and back to the supplementary motor cortex. Now, putamen is the major part involved in voluntary motor activity, as you can see from this circuit, and putamen and supplementary areas are involved in planning for the motor activity. This is the Putamen circuit. Okay, the Caudate circuit. The caudate is an association nucleus, i.e. it receives from all association cortex of the cerebral hemisphere, and that's why it's comma shaped, to collect all the fibers coming out of the association cortex. It projects to the caudate nucleus, then from it to the globus pallidus, through the thalamic fasciculus to the thalamus, ventroanterior and mediodorsal or dorsomedial nucleus, and back to the prefrontal cortex. This is on the inferior surface of the brain. It's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the lateral side. There's a lateral orbitofrontal cortex and the medial orbitofrontal cortex, and all together are the inferior part of the frontal lobe, inferior surface of the frontal lobe. This is the caudate circuit. Now the substantia nigra circuit, outflow coming out of the cerebral cortex to the striatum, corpus striatum I mean, and from there the substantia nigra reticulata receives the input, while the substantia nigra compacta sends the outflow through dopaminergic fibers to the thalamus, to the ventroanterior, ventrolateral, and mediodorsal or dorsomedial nuclei of the thalamus, and few to the superior colliculus also as well, and from there to the cerebral, back to the cerebral cortex. Observe that the substantia nigra compacta does not receive info from striatum, only sends outflow. And the substantia nigra, by that way, it has a double connection with the striatum, back and forth. Damage of these dopaminergic fibers we talked about from the coming out from the substantia nigra compacta leads to the Parkinsonism. These fibers are involved in Parkinsonism. The substantia nigra reticulata acts like the globus pallidus. It receives fibers from the striatum and then sends back to the cortex. Dopaminergic fibers are called the Nigra striator fibers. Dopaminergic fibers also, when they examine them, they have two types of dopamine receptors. Those called D1 receptors, they activate what's so-called the direct pathway of the circuitry of the basal ganglia, the end result of which it facilitates movement. And if stimulation occurs of the D2 receptors, these will activate what's so-called the indirect pathway of circuitry, and this the end result of which is inhibition of movements. So it's the balance between the activity of these two circuits determined by the activation of D1 and D2 receptors that determines the movement. Okay? This is how the basal ganglia work. The subthalamic circuit receives output from the cerebral cortex through the striatum, the corpus striatum, then through striatopallidal fibers to the GP externum, the globus pallidus externum, and from there to the subthalamic nucleus and back to the globus pallidus internum. See, the subthalamic nucleus are midway between the outflow from the receipt of fibers at the globus pallidus externum and the outflow from the globus pallidus internum. This means that the subthalamic nucleus modifies the activity of the globus pallidus as a whole. And from there, from the internum to the thalamus, to the ventrolateral or ventroanterior and mediodorsal or dorsomedial and centromedial nucleus of the thalamus, and from there back to the cerebral cortex. The input, as I told you, to the GPE and the output from the GPI, and by the position of subthalamic nucleus in this circuit, this means that it determines the output of the globus pallidus. Well, I hope you had the maximum benefits from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.